Today we're going to be talking about political participation. And first I'd like to welcome you to my nice little resort that I happen to be sitting at right now. It was either this or the Death Star. Anyway, so this is my green screen in case you're just kind of wondering about that. But before we start off, I'd like to talk about New Zealand. Many of you may not actually know this, but they went through a really interesting process of trying to change their government and trying to get more people to actually participate in their elections. And one of the things they did is they changed from kind of like a winner-takes-all system to a more proportional representation system. And when they did it, they found they got more and more people actually participating, which was a really good thing. And it kind of proved a lot of theories that people had, that as you made it so more people were represented and more people were able to be a part of the government or to have representation through the government or feel like they had it, then they would participate more. Well, that's how it started, and then about 10 years passed and we started to fall off again. People stopped participating, people stopped voting, and so there seems to be a little more actually going on than just that. Well, part of the problem with participation is the fact that whether or not people actually vote is not as important as whether or not they actually get to vote. And for years in the United States, when we did the whole idea of everyone being able to vote, you know, the Franklin ideas, one of the problems we ran into is we didn't want to give a whole lot of people the right to vote. And so originally, in order to vote in this country, you had to be a property-owning male. And this lasted for a long time, about 50 years, until they actually started adding more and more people to it. So they made it so you didn't have to actually own property anymore. And it became one of those problems where it was literally the elites were the only ones able to vote because, A, they had the only ones with time, and B, they had the money and they could actually influence other people to actually vote the way that they wanted. And there were all sorts of other little things that were kind of like falling on the wayside or things that needed to be addressed. There was the Australian ballot, which, if you're not familiar with what that means, is instead of the ability of just walking in and having people know exactly who you're going to vote for, this became more of a anonymous type of a process to get things done. And then we moved away from party line votes, although we still have a little bit of that kind of left right now. But one of the other things that kind of came along that was a problem is we still had people unable to vote. And the term that we use for it is called suffrage, people not able to actually vote. And so first thing we did is we gave the non-property owners the ability to vote. Then the next thing was there were foreign-born citizens in the United States, or citizens, and they generally were not allowed to vote unless they were, you know, white males of a particular ethnic background, and they would do all sorts of things to make it so they were not able to vote. We had things called poll taxes, which basically you had to own property. That was kind of the beginning of that, or continuation of that. Then the other thing they actually did was a citizenship test, where they would make the test really, really difficult for the people who they didn't want to actually vote. So if you saw somebody coming in from the opposite party and you were the person handling the voting, you'd make the test extremely hard and impossible for someone to actually pass. And so the next thing they did is they added, well, didn't add, but after Civil War and all this, the African Americans finally got the ability to vote. Then there were women who were not able to vote before, because basically only males were allowed to vote in this country. And that didn't happen until the 1920s. And then later, around the Vietnam era, which is the 1960s, 1970s, 18-year-olds were now allowed to vote, because the argument was that if they were out there defending the country, then why shouldn't they be able to vote for their country? One of the problems we have with voting itself, or getting people to participate in voting, is we set up a system where you have to actually register to vote. Some countries actually allow you to just sign, you don't have to sign up. You're already registered just by the fact that you're a citizen, or a part of that society. Our country made it a little more difficult. And part of that was there's about a good percentage of the government that doesn't want other people to participate. Because there's the old argument, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later, of how if you're in power and you're the only one able to vote, then you have a lot more power than if everybody else is actually voting. And so originally voting registration was designed around the idea that there was this fear that people were going to go in and cast more than one ballot. We still have that fear today. It's constantly used as a argument that we need to enforce all sorts of weird standards or draconian standards. And the thing is, people generally tend to vote once. Then you'll get an obscure case where somebody may have done it more than once, and then suddenly it's considered to be, a pandemic of what's going on with voting. Probably pandemic is the wrong word to use at this particular time. The other thing is voting registration, it kind of keeps citizens from voting. Why it sounds like it's a little off on that if you think about it. But what happens is when you make voting registration required, you're going to find fewer people actually wanting to vote. And studies have shown that the more voting registration or the more stringent requirements on voting or registering to vote causes fewer and fewer people to actually participate in voting. And so that's always been kind of a problem as well. So like I said, the studies have actually shown that voting's actually declined as registration became required. In 1993, we have what's called the Motor Voter Act, which is the idea that when you go in and actually get your driver's license, you're automatically signed up for voting. And so this was a positive thing, and a lot of people, at least on one side of the aisle, thought this was a really good idea to get more people to vote. The other side of the aisle doesn't want a certain amount of people to vote, so they kind of do everything possible to make sure that it's impossible for it to happen. And sometimes it doesn't matter what party, it just may be on, it could be elites versus non-elites, or it could be people with money, people who don't have money, and all those sorts of things. It's the delineations between the two of them. So there are a couple of deterrents to voting, which causes the problem of fewer people participating. Because, I mean, we have less than 50% in this country that actually vote during a presidential election, unless it's a really, really contested election. Sometimes we'll actually have a higher numbers, but pretty rare. You'd think that they would keep increasing, but they don't. During the Obama nomination, there were a lot more people actually participating, but the numbers were still dismally low. So one of the deterrents to voting is basically long lines. So I remember a while back when I actually went and had to vote myself when I was in Michigan. It took me 2.5 hours to vote, and people dropped out. They were just like sitting there going, I can't wait around for this. I've got more important things to do. And then they went home and watched television. One of the other things as a deterrent to voting is called poll taxes. And poll taxes is the idea that if you have property, they basically, you had to pay taxes in order to vote. And so citizenship tests are another thing, and I mentioned that earlier, and that's what they would do is if you didn't want somebody to vote and they came in and they were standing in front of you, well, you couldn't tell them you can't vote, but you could tell them, tell me who the 14th president was. If they couldn't tell you, then, well, they're obviously not set up to vote. At least that's how the process worked. So that Supreme Court cases made that impossible, or made that so it shouldn't be happening any further. And almost every election, there's a case or two of something like that still going on in some small area where nobody thought it would actually happen. And again, it's still happening again. People will do pretty much anything they can to suppress other people from voting because basically it's taking power away from them. One of the other things they've added recently, which is kind of going back to the beginning, is voter identification cards. So sometimes it's just an ID card, your regular ID card, and what it generally does is it kind of makes it difficult for people who can't afford those or don't have the opportunities to get those sorts of things to be able to vote. And so it tends to focus on a certain segment of the population, and it continues to happen pretty much every election. There's what's called the elitist approach to elections. And the idea is, if you're familiar with Edmund Burke, now you may not actually recognize the name, but you probably heard his famous phrase that he never actually said, or may have not actually said. And it's the phrase, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." It's a great quotation, but he also had another kind of dubious claim to fame. As a politician, he liked to believe that he was a good representative for the people that he represented, and he represented a lot of people who were basically the opposite of what he was. He was a very well-to-do Englishman, and the majority of the people he was representing were not. But he thought, because I'm smart enough and because I can, really understand the plight that these people would be going through, I can represent them just as well as anybody else. And so that's constantly or it's continuously a controversial situation, and there are still people who believe that, and so we run into that when we get into elections. So part of the elitist approach to that, if you take it a little further, is that the fewer amount of people who are actually voting means more power to the elites. So if I'm an elite, I'm a rich person, I'm not well represented in the community because there's not a whole lot of rich people. I'm not saying I am, but if I was. Therefore, if I have fewer of the other people voting, the people who don't have power and don't have money, then I have more power than when I first started, because if they're not allowed to participate, I'm allowed to make decisions for both me and them. So the other one of the problems that the elitist approach tends to take in is there's a claim that the masses are generally misinformed, that they have bad information, that they make bad choices. They make choices off of just, personal passions rather than their real, thought out concepts. So more of a pathos approach than a logos approach to kind of what they're doing. So it's something to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about participation in voting. So speaking of voting, who's more likely to vote? Well, what you'll find is party loyalists tend to be the more, not obligated, but the more passionate about actual voting. And so there's a sense of civic duty, and we teach that through schools. The original idea of schools in this country, or in most countries if you think about it, is to indoctrinate the people to basically pick up the mantle of society and continue things on the way that they are. You don't want a protest society or a society that's constantly fighting against the system. You want a society that grows up to accept the system and to continue to perpetuate it going forward. And so that's kind of where the civic duty part comes in. So about the 1960s or so, we kind of had a little change in that, as in there's a huge protest movement. Younger people tended to be very much against the status quo. And so that's never really changed. It's kind of grown over the years, and we have ebb and flows on that, but it still kind of maintains itself throughout our history and also through our current time. So, but there are other ways you can actually participate in voting. Well, not just voting, in government itself. You don't have to actually physically go out and vote. I mean, if you look at the idea of Rousseau, who talked about the only times we're actually really a democracy is when we're actually voting, which meant he felt that during the rest of the time we're basically just a dictatorship. But there are other ways to participate without actually having to physically vote. And I don't think Rousseau would have actually agreed with this until he would have seen some of this happen in later years. well, he wouldn't have seen it, but I mean, many years after his death. And so, like, for one thing is campaigning. And when you're campaigning, you're not actually voting. You may be trying to influence votes, or you can be lobbying. You can try to get members of Congress or members of government to do things that you want to have done. But those are particular issues that don't actually involve a specific vote. And so that is participation. There's also a very recent kind of a process called virtual participation. During the Obama administration, it started, well, basically it started a little earlier than his administration, but it wasn't really big and popular yet. It was the idea of doing online polls. So there were a couple of situations where he indicated that if there was an online poll that had a certain amount of percentage of people that wanted something done, he would actually respond that way. And one of the ones was to release the information about Area 51. And so he followed up on it and basically did what people had asked to do. There were a couple of situations like that. Like there was one, they wanted to create a Death Star. So, I mean, sometimes these virtual participation things kind of get a little ridiculous, but at the same time, it's people being engaged. And when they're engaged in the system and engaged in wanting things done or just wanting people to hear their voice, and that's a big problem, is we don't have a lot of voice hearing. We have a lot of voice talking. So there's a lot of people talking at you, but there's not a whole lot of people listening to you. And that is one of the bigger problems we have. One of the other areas of participation that we do have, and it's very much there and it happens all the time, and that's community activities. So you don't have to be nationally involved in order to be participating in your society. You can actually be bowling with other people, and there's actually a famous book on that called Bowling Alone. And the idea is by participating with other people, by being with other people, you're influencing their ideas, they're influencing your ideas, and so you're sharing information to help come up with the ideas that the country needs or that your society needs or your local area needs, because not everything has to be national. Some things can be local. So this kind of leads to what's called unconventional activism. And we've kind of moved a little further because in the old days, and I like to say the old days, but who knows when they actually were, what we used to have was a sense of this is the society and this is the way you actually do things. Well, like I said, around the 1960s, you started to see a little bit of a different movement, and it was a younger generation that was no longer accepting the ideas of the past. Now, this isn't the first time this actually happened. You know, after World War II, a number of situations even before that, after the Civil War. I mean, there were situations where younger people or people who were not part of the system started to try to fight back against the system by trying to get people organized. And so what we've led to is an idea of political movements, like all sorts of huge ones that were happening over the last couple of elections. And so these are people who are generally not heard before that are trying to get their voices heard. And so quite often that requires getting a lot of people together. And unfortunately, like George W. Bush stated during his presidency, when 200,000 people stated they wanted something done or were against a particular action that he was making, he basically called that a focus group and didn't care. And so, and that's literally what he pretty much said. And so that's the kind of problem you have, is sometimes no matter how many people you have together, it's if the politician doesn't want to go along with you, you end up with a dynamic that is really difficult to get anything done, and people get really, really concerned and they start dropping out of the system. And so that's kind of what's been happening in this country for many, many years, is people keep dropping out of the system. And so part of the system says that it's apathy, that they just don't care. Well, it's not that they don't care, it's just they have no voice. And if you have no voice, you start to get really concerned. And the problem with that is that leads to protests, and sometimes protests can lead to riots, and riots can lead to overthrowing of systems. And so that's always been a problem. I mean, democracy is designed around the idea that the majority of the people make a decision, and if the majority of the people aren't listened to, or you have literally half the entire country not being listened to, you end up with all sorts of horrible circumstances. So I want to talk about somebody named Carol Pateman. She was a political philosopher who, well, more of a political scientist, who came up with the idea of studying minors in England. And what she was really interested in was, or what she came about after her interest, was realizing that as you educated more and more of these minors, they became more politically active. And that doesn't mean they ran for office, but they really were much more interested in actually doing something about voting and making decisions for political offices going forward. Whereas in the same communities, previously they were not at all. And so they weren't involved in anything. And so one of the other problems we tend to run into is this belief that apathy exists, that people don't care, that it's just not important to them. Like they're more concerned with voting for, you know, who gets to stay on the island as opposed to who gets off the island, rather than who becomes their representative in their local or national government. Well, it could also be they're satisfied. And so the argument is out there constantly as to whether or not it's one or the other, whereas it could be both. And so it's important to kind of look at that and see, why are people not participating? And is there something to do to make them participate more? And then one further question, and this is the one that tends to get glossed over most of the time, and that's, should we be focused on whether or not more people should be participating? Because if people are happy and they don't have a problem, then is there a problem? But if people are realizing they have no voice and can't get a voice, then you have a problem, because that leads to future problems. So that's pretty much all I have for the lecture for today. Like I said, hope you enjoyed my my background here, which is a nice day wherever this actually might be. So I'll talk to you next time.